What if I told you that one sentence written 235 years ago is the only thing standing between the government telling your pastor who can preach in the pulpit this weekend, or which religion your taxes are going to support, or teaching your children in school that now there is one official church for the United States? Does that sound impossible? It really isn't. And right now, there are millions of Americans who aren't sure that they want that sentence anymore. Sounds like something for the Divide podcast. And today, we're going to see where faith draws the line. Welcome back to The Divide. This is exciting for me because we're launching our fourth episode, and now I can say thank you for joining from your favorite platform. If you like to listen on Apple Podcast or Spotify or Amazon Music or iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcast, you can find the Divide podcast there, and I just want to say thank you. And of course, I'm on YouTube as well with the video version for those that like to watch. And of course, we put illustrations and pictures from time to time up on the video side of things. So thanks for joining me today as we continue building this show out. I want to say thank you to all the folks that are supporting me and helping me to get this going, who gave me encouragement to get it going as well. If you want to reach out to the show, you can reach me at the Divide Podcast at benorian.com. It's BENORIAN.com. The Divide Podcast at benorian.com. Love to hear your emails there. And of course, you can find me on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, although I'm not there very often. Probably start posting some things on TikTok, shorts of the show as well. Love to have you connect with me there. And always, please, likes, shares, and subscribes. That helps me out tremendously. So thank you in advance for doing that. Somebody asked me at the end of last show, up in the top corner of the video, there's a countdown timer and it started at 28 minutes. Last week we left time on the clock. And so if I'd have been in a sports game, I would have lost. But the reason I'm doing that is everybody's got their own little gimmick. I figure from time to time I'm going to have guests on, and so I wanted them to be able to know where we're at on the time frame, because eventually I'm in the process of getting this program out on radio as well. So 28-minute programs for radio, and that's what that's all about. So yeah, I left time on the clock last week, which is funny because I am a sports fan and trying to get that right down to the exact minute. I was telling my wife last night that I have watched more soccer in the last couple of days than I have in my entire life. I think I've watched a game and a half. My in-laws are all from Argentina, and so they've been rooting for Argentina. And if you're into the World Cup, you know that Argentina, as I'm recording this, just beat England a day ago, and so the finals are coming up this coming weekend, and Argentina and Spain. I was driving in this morning to the office listening to sports talk radio, and they were talking about how Argentina has scored, and I think it was something like 12 out of their 17 goals in the World Cup after the 75th minute, and that just is a staggering number to me. They're coming from behind and they're winning in the last few moments. So that's pretty cool. Whatever you do for fun, I hope you have an enjoyable time this weekend. I am planning to watch the final. I don't know what I'm watching. I don't know the rules, but it has been fun to sit there with my wife and enjoy those few moments. Okay, enough about that. Let's get into the topic for today. And why is everybody suddenly arguing about church and state again? It's on the news. You scroll 5 minutes on social media, prayer in school, 10 commandments on the classroom walls. Recently, a governor invoked scripture from the floor of the legislature. It's all over the place. And even more recently, just a few weeks ago, as I'm recording this in June 26th to be exact, standing in the Oval Office right behind the President of the United States, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick of Texas, who is the new chairman of the White House Commission on Religious Liberty, he made a statement that got people really upset, especially on social media. It created quite the frenzy. And so what was it that he said? I'll put it on the screen for those that are watching online. The separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, he says. And from this day forward, if anyone says that to you, and they're in public office or serve in any agency in any official capacity, they have to point out exactly where you have violated the Constitution, because you have not. And here's this last sentence. And from this day forward, that phrase should have no power over people of faiths ever again. The idea of the separation of church and state having no power over people of all faiths ever again in America. Douglas Laycock, a professor of constitutional law at the University of Texas Law School, called Patrick's statement a very old claim from people who want to use government power to impose their religious practices on other people. Now, that's a powerful statement. Those that want to do away with the separation between church and state, he says that this is an old claim from people who want to use government power to impose their religious practices on other people. And so in the middle of all that noise, you find people who are smart, and you find people who know history, and all of a sudden they're agreeing with them. And it's one narrow, very technical point. They may not agree with where he's wanting to go with it, but they're agreeing with him on this simple little point that if you go back and you read the Constitution front to back, you'll never find the phrase separation of church and state. It's just not there, not even once. Which raises the question, if that phrase isn't in the Constitution, then why is everybody so upset about church and state not being separate? Well, let's go find out what the First Amendment actually says. And for those that are watching, again, we'll put it on the screen. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedoms of speech or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, or to petition the government for a redress of governance. So there's a whole bunch of items that are tucked into this First Amendment giving us rights and privileges, but the one that I'm focusing on are the first 21 words or so there. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. 21 words about religion tucked inside a long sentence about a few other freedoms as well. And these 21 words legitimately have changed human history. I mean, because before the United States experiment of freedom, religious freedom, there was never any such thing in the history of the world previous to this. Now, there might have been tolerance here and there, and some will argue that the Roman government gave tolerance to various religions and so forth. And that is true, that there were periods of time within Rome when there was freedom to worship as they wanted. But for the next less than 20 minutes, about 19 minutes and 45 seconds, I want to share some stories. I want to go back in time to a different Sunday morning before the United States was even the United States. I want to go back to American colonies before the Revolutionary War. And in fact, I want to go back to the time when the colonies were just being established. I want to show you why this phrase and the separation of church and state is so important. We go back all the way to 1631 to Massachusetts Bay, and there's a young minister who has just gotten off a ship, and his name is Roger Williams. Now, he's fresh off a boat from England, and he's watching with his own eyes what happens when states decide to have their own religion. He's seen dissenters who are whipped, and he's seen people who are imprisoned or burned, and so he's coming to the colonies because he's expecting to find something different. Now, you got to remember, 11 years before, the Pilgrims came and landed at Plymouth Rock, and they were coming. Why? Because they were trying to escape the religious persecution that they were experiencing in Europe. Here's the problem. What Roger Williams finds when he gets to Massachusetts Bay is a colony that's fled persecution, but turned around and built their own version of it. Now, it's basically a different verse, but it's the same song. Puritans hadn't come to America to invent religious freedom. They came to get their religious uniformity right. and England wouldn't let them have it, so they came here. Now, Roger Williams, of all people, is the one who stands up in the middle of all of this, and he says, look, civil magistrates have no business telling anybody what their conscience is, and they shouldn't even try to be protecting what true faith is. If a person doesn't want to believe the Bible, they shouldn't have to. Now, the response of the colony was to banish Roger Williams. And so in October 1635, the General Court ordered him to leave within 6 weeks or face arrest or possibly worse. Now, the problem is Williams is sick. Well, winter is closing in on New England, and New England winters can be extremely harsh and brutal, especially in that time and era. And so the court gives him a stay of mercy. They let him wait until spring to leave. The only thing is he has to be quiet. But how many preachers do you know that can actually keep quiet? He doesn't. And so in January of 1636, he's been trying to preach. And so he decides, okay, I've got to flee. And so rather than wait to be dragged out with a handful of followers, he bought land from the Native American Indians that were living there, and he found this settlement that he names Providence, thanking God for it, even though he's in exile. So Providence becomes a place where Quakers and Baptists and really anyone else in the rest of New England, they can come and they can find tolerance for their religious freedoms, their religious beliefs. Now, the people who fled England to escape religious persecution became the people running religious persecution in Massachusetts. And I'm not exaggerating for effect. There were Quakers who were hung on Boston Common in the 1660s. There were Baptists who were fined or whipped or jailed for the crime of preaching without a license. And Massachusetts was still doing it all over about a century later. The irony, sitting at the center of colonial American Christianity, is that they came looking for freedom, and yet they were not giving the freedom to their own residents. Okay, so with that in mind, now let's push forward about 140 years down to Virginia, right around the time a young Virginia planter named James Madison is coming of age. Now, you'll recognize the name Madison because he's the 4th president of the United States. Now, when Madison is a kid in the middle 1760s and 70s, this is right before the American independence, Virginia during this time has an established church. It's the Anglican Church, and the Anglican Church is supported by tax and protected by law. Now, there are Baptist preachers who are coming into Virginia, and they're itinerant. They don't have licenses to preach in Virginia, but they're showing up along the countryside. They're holding revivals, and as a result, they're getting arrested because the Anglican priests are like, hey, no, wait, they're preaching against us. We got to get rid of them. And so they would be jailed behind jail cells. And in those days, the jail cells had these bars in them, but they were open. And so the preachers would stand in the jail cell window and they would preach to passerbys. And the people that were passing by, they would stop and listen to them. So crowds were gathering outside the window because, well, that was the only pulpit that the law would allow the preachers to have. And so there's some irony there. And Madison is watching this. He's probably about 22 years of age or so. And by his own account, he sees this and it disturbs him. And it's not that he's a Baptist, because he's not. It's because he's watching the machinery of the state pushing down on a person's conscience. And it offended him. And it was something that he was never willing to let go. That memory of men in jail cells preaching, and they're in jail because they were preaching the wrong sermon, that just stayed with Madison. And so when he gets to Philadelphia and they're drafting the Bill of Rights, he says, hey, wait a minute, let's do something a little different. And it's not just Madison either. Years later, in 1802, there's a Baptist association in Danbury, Connecticut. Now, a religious minority in that state, by the way, Connecticut in 1802 still has an established church. They write to the new president, Thomas Jefferson. because they're worried about their own liberty. Now, the Bill of Rights is being written and adopted, but it hasn't been fully implemented in all the states at that point yet. And that's all in process as this is happening. And so this little Baptist association, Danbury, Connecticut, they write to Thomas Jefferson, who's the brand new president. They're worried about their liberty, and Jefferson writes back to them. He takes a moment, and in that letter, he uses a phrase that's going to outlive him for centuries. In fact, we still use it. I used it already in this podcast. He describes the First Amendment as building a wall of separation between church and state. Now, that's the phrase that's not in the Constitution, but the wall of separation between the church and state. So the government makes no rules or laws about about religion, and that's what that's all about. And so in Jefferson's own paraphrase in a letter, he explains that he believes those 21 words were built to be a wall between the church and the state. All right, so what do I have so far? I've got Roger Williams being banished for saying that government shouldn't coerce religion. Baptists being jailed for practicing their faith, preaching without a license. Madison watching it all happen. Jefferson naming what the wall is. Now, none of this is happening in a vacuum. In fact, that's just what's going on here in the Americas, in the colonies, and in the earliest years of American independence. But we can actually go back further in time to Europe, a much bloodier point in time. People had been coming to America, fleeing religious persecution, and they become the people doing the persecution. It's a repetition of history. So let's zoom out and go back beyond America entirely. Let's go back to 1517. And really, 1517 is considered the opening year of the Reformation. That's because in 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And this starts a whole onslaught of papal decrees and religious dialogue, and it's all based on, and basically what you have now is the beginnings of Catholic versus Protestant faiths, and each one is convicted and convinced that the other one is in heresy and needs to be stamped out. And sometimes stamping out the religious beliefs meant stamping out the people. So by the time we get to 1555, German princes hammer out a truce, and it's called the Peace of Augsburg. Now, the Peace of Augsburg basically has this statement that says whoever rules the territory decides the religion. So if your prince is Catholic, guess what? You've got to be Catholic. If the prince converts and becomes a Protestant, then you need to convert and become a Protestant also, because conscience follows the crown. Now, obviously, the truce couldn't hold. There's no way for it to, because you can't actually legislate belief. You can only legislate behavior. And eventually the gap between belief and behavior explodes. And in Europe, you have what's known as the 30 Years' War from roughly 1618 to about 1648. It's one of the deadliest conflicts in European history before the 20th century. And largely, this whole war is fought on the fault line that the Peace of Augsburg had tried to set up. Whoever was in power is how you believe. And so there were whole regions of Germany that lost up to a third of their population. And it wasn't just about persecution. It was full-on war, because the two had become the same thing. Government and religion were now the same. Now, all of this is going on, and shortly after this, there comes another guy who's not very happy about this. You've heard about him, Henry VIII. He's on the other side of the channel, and he's got a problem. He wants a divorce, and the Pope isn't giving him a divorce. So he just decides, you know what? I'm not going to be Catholic anymore. We're going to have our own church here in England, and I'm going to be the head of that church, and we're not going to be doing business with Rome anymore. So overnight, the King of England became the arbiter of English Christianity. He decided what faith looked like. which meant he could get divorced, and which meant that everybody else living in England didn't have to be Catholic anymore. They could just follow him and do whatever. And that also meant, though, that the next monarch could reverse whatever Henry VIII had done. And that's exactly what happened. Under Henry's daughter Mary, Protestants were burned. So you have this complete reversal. Henry decides he wants to be Protestant. He breaks away from Rome. And then Mary comes in. Nope, she's back to Catholic. And then Mary has a half-sister who comes to power. Her name is Elizabeth. The pendulum swings back the other way, and Catholics are paying the price. It's all on the same island. It's all in the same exact church buildings, just blood being shed depending on who's wearing the crown from that decade. And this is the pattern. And once you see it, you can just go back in history, century after century, decade after decade. Whenever a new government and a religion become dependent on each other, whenever the state needs the church's legitimacy and the church needs the state's sword, then an arrangement gets made and it turns on everybody or somebody. And it's not really about which religion is winning at that point. It's about what happens the moment religion becomes the tool of the state power instead of a matter of conscience. That's the deal. If it's about coercion, your conscience doesn't matter. Which brings me to the bigger point of this whole thing, and that's the Ten Commandments. Bigger than America, bigger than any single controversy in the news. Why do governments keep wanting to regulate religion in the first place? And the answer is simply this: because religion is a powerful way, in a way that almost nothing else is. Religion doesn't just organize people, it unifies them at a level of loyalty. You see, a government that can attach itself to something like that gets legitimacy that money can't buy, but that armies, and really armies can't provide, but armies can enforce. So a government that feels threatened by this, by a loyalty of a higher state throughout history, either tries to control it or crush it. Rarely does it leave it alone, because leaving it alone historically is strange and rare. So religion becomes the final point of contention. So let's come back to today. In April 2026, just a few months ago, a federal appeals court in the Fifth Circuit, sitting as a full court, ruled 9-8 that Texas can require every public school classroom in the state to post the Ten Commandments. The law is called Senate Bill number 10, and basically it requires not only that the Ten Commandments be posted, it requires what size, minimum size, they can be as well. Now, the plaintiffs in this case were a multi-faith group of Texas families backed by the ACLU, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and they call it a direct betrayal of the First Amendment. And they're still fighting it because Louisiana and Arkansas have similar laws that they're working through as well. Those probably will end up in the Supreme Court as well. So what are we talking about? What I'm trying to say is that right now in the courts in America, there is contention about where the separating line between church and state should be. And as I mentioned, Dan Patrick, the Texas Lieutenant Governor, he's already pushing that there should be no wall of separation between church and state. Makes me feel like I'm watching Roger Williams, Massachusetts all over again. Now, I'm not here to tell you who's right in the cases. That's not my point. I have opinions, and you probably do too. And neither one of us probably need my podcast to decide what's right or wrong. I don't want you to miss out on what's going on behind the scenes, though. You see, there is a real power struggle going on. And they've been trying to decide what 4-year-olds and 14-year-olds are going to see on the wall for the days of their education for the next 50 years. And this is the most religiously pluralistic country that has ever existed. And yet, all of a sudden, they're trying to tell us what we can and can't do. So what do you think? I do think it matters. And who wins the argument is concerning to me. And I just want to be on the record letting you know that I stand for the freedom of conscience. And at the same time, I wonder if we've forgotten why the First Amendment existed in the first place. And that's really what this whole thing is about. It really is human nature and governments left to their own instincts, trying to find uniformity, because in uniformity, it's easier to govern, it's easier to unify, it's easier to justify power if we're all going in the same direction. And if you put those two things in the same bed, government's hunger for uniformity and religion's claim to the absolute, you just don't have stability. History shows us anything but stability. And Jesus had to answer this question 1,000 years before Madison, 2,000 years before Madison would ever pick up a pen. Someone hands him a coin and tries to trap him in this exact argument. He says, hey, who should we give this to, Caesar or to God? And Jesus answers in one of the most amazing ways. He said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. Two different kinds of allegiance. They are not the same allegiance wearing two hats. And then standing in front of Pilate, with his life on the line, Jesus says it even more plainly. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my people would be fighting for me right now. But they weren't. Because you can't compel worship, but you can compel attendance. You can compel a signature, a recitation, a poster on the wall, but you cannot compel the thing itself, and that is to get somebody to turn their heart freely to God. The moment you force it, it stops being worship and starts being coercion. It starts being really theater. Real worship requires freedom the way that real love requires the ability to make a choice and walk away. You take away the freedom. If you take away freedom, you haven't purified faith. You've just killed it and kept it standing there where everyone can see it. Look, prayer in the Oval Office, prayer in the Capitol, Supreme Court, whatever tradition you want to call it, whatever you were raised to call God, I'll stand there with you. I have no problem with that. I believe in the freedom of conscience. I've sat at prayer breakfasts and heard the rabbi pray and sat next to the imam as he prayed, or had a priest pray right after me. They use different words, and some of them may even believe in a different God than the one I believe in. I chose not to be offended, because nobody was forcing me to say amen. Now, whether we pray in public, that was never the actual question. The question is whether anyone gets forced to believe in private on someone else's terms. Because America can pray together, it just can't make you pray their way. Because the moment prayer turns into policy and belief turns into law, you've crossed a line that God never asked you to cross. God never forces a single human heart to love him. So maybe we shouldn't either. I hope that you've enjoyed today's program. With about 15 seconds left, send me your feedback, thedividepodcast@benorian.com. Find me on the socials. Like, share, and subscribe. I love hearing from you. Look forward to seeing you next time, because to me, this is The Divide. It's where faith draws the line.